we really need to get to the bottom of this. And I think it is because of the complexity with regard to where Eskom finds itself at the moment. There's a lot going on with Eskom. There's a lot that, many people have to answer for. Many people have their tentacles in Eskom in one way or another. There was talk about, syndicates that are operating in Eskom. And these are, in some instances, unknown by some people, they would say, but then they won't tell you, they play that game with you. Things like the quality of coal that messes up, the equipment. This is not new.
And you interestingly think about this. Former President Thabo Mbeki on screen right now, arriving. That particular conversation around the adding of more energy to the grid would have taken place during his time. And you fast forward now, South Africa is finding itself in this particular crisis. And Sakina, I remember listening to Eskom and the SIU before Scopa, and they talk about, mind-boggling things. Some cameras that are switched off in some of these, stores, depart offices, and you then hear as well of trucks that would make their way out with the coal, come back empty, coal delivered elsewhere, coal that would then be mixed with other coal and then fake the tests and say the coal meets the standards and it doesn't. And some of those with these companies that transport the coal are inside the companies. A lot going on. And when you look at what has happened there, you want to understand, did anybody take responsibility for it? Is anybody behind bars? Because some of the questions that arose during that sitting was people resigning when they know that a hearing has now been put in place, and in 30 days they're gone and you can't follow up.
But think about how we are handling this, how it's being addressed. Remember during the time when the Guptas had taken over Glencore, remember there was talk about substandard coal that was being supplied to Eskom. And all the urgency that came with, the state capture narrative, and we need to arrest this, we need to deal with it. And people moved on it. So why aren't we moving on it now? If a truck is veering off route, and at this point, everybody knows what's happening. Why are you allowing that truck to offload when it gets to the power station?
It tells you that a lot of the problems are inside. And do you know the people that are inside that you should be asking tough questions? One would expect that they would. And I think, Sakina, it also adds another layer to this conversation. You think back to the evidence we heard in the State Capture Commission of Inquiry about what is said to have happened at Eskom, and we're still awaiting to this day to know what exactly happened through the courts now, to see convictions and to understand what's going on. And right there, Sakina, while South Africans are waiting, they are now finding themselves again waiting to know when more power will be added to the grid, so everyone can then have a stable supply of electricity.
But there are more questions to be asked as well. I remember going back to the mooting of nuclear power as a potential solution during the Jacob Zuma administration. And at the time, you remember Rosatom and what was going on there. And let's just pause that conversation there for a moment, taking you to the live visuals in front of us.
And that's Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. Interestingly, as we're talking about the State Capture Commission, he just arrives, and we're talking about, of course, the report there, the Chief Justice among those dignitaries who are there tonight. And we are, of course, expecting his deputy, Justice Mandisamaya, to be there with 15 other judges as well. And these are part of the 263 other dignitaries that will be there, who will be sitting, of course, inside. And we do know that about 400 of the National Assembly members will be there. The 90 members of the NCOP will also be joining and making it 490 in total.
And then there are members of SALGA who will also be there. So, of course, a joint sitting of the two houses of Parliament is the State of the Nation address, where the President will, of course, be speaking to both houses of Parliament and, of course, to the rest of us as well. And, it's very interesting once again, we go through the motions of what SONA brings year in and year out. Also just listening, I haven't forgotten about ESCOM, but listening to the explanations this morning, and there was almost a justification for why we should have this sort of procession, the pomp and ceremony. I listened to Lindiwe Zulu also speaking about why this is important. We must preserve some of these traditions. And I couldn't help but wonder, why? Why should we?
And I'm thinking back to a conversation you had with the National Assembly Speaker, Unosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, and part of what she had to say was that some of the money allocated here needs to be used because this is a once a year, and you must have the red carpet. Everywhere else in the world it is done for the president and all of that. But also, Sakina, in the same breath, talking about the National Assembly, the old one that is, which is yet to be rebuilt, and we're looking at 3 years, and that is just for only inside. We're not talking about the systems that are needed to work. So one looks at the juxtaposition of the 8 million rand that she says may not even be utilized all of it today, but interestingly she says it might be more, it might be less. So you then wonder if it's still going to take about 3 years for the National Assembly building to be functional, and potentially 5 years or 4 years, we don't know. Should a lot of it not go towards that, to accelerate that, because they're complaining that some of the MPs are not showing up?
Yeah, but as a matter of fact, the money that is being spent on this particular ceremony, from my understanding from that conversation, is from the 2 billion rand that was allocated during the medium-term budget policy statement by Minister Enoch Godongwana for the refurbishment of the National Assembly building. So yes, the money is there, but some of that money now has to be used for this purpose. And as you say, if this is going to take a few more years, you have to weigh up, what is happening, how fast is it happening, is it worth the cost?
And they said it's not going to be as pomp and ceremony as we've seen it to be in the past, but a lot of South Africans, Sakina, I remember when we had that briefing from the speakers, and they were saying, it won't be as pomp, it won't be as extravagant, but we are taking into account everything that needs to be done. People took to social media and said there are serious socioeconomic issues in this country. Should we not be talking about prioritizing that and simply just having the State of the Nation address? So it's interesting, some of the conversations that happen on the sidelines of this. And as I was listening to your conversation this morning, people were already tweeting saying, but our priorities in order as a country? And I suppose it is an interesting conversation then to have.
It is a very interesting conversation, but I think as a nation, we are so wounded at the moment that whatever is going on, we will find fault with. Because to be fair, they have, as Parliament, toned down tremendously. I remember the days when I first came to the State of the Nation address. That was pomp and ceremony, and everything that went with it. The monies that were spent, the galas afterwards, you would have buses arriving to pick people up and transport them, and all sorts of things that were happening. So if you compare that to where we are now, yes, they have toned down quite a lot, but is it enough? Because I think the question now is whether we actually need this sort of procession, this sort of pomp and ceremony. There's also a question about whether we should actually have it in the evening like this, or whether we should go back to having it like the budget speech, have it at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Can the president just stand there, give the speech, and be done?
And one person that we'll also be chatting to about this is a brigadier general who's extremely involved in what we'll then see as, the parade, the music, the 21-gun salute, the significance of it. And it'll be interesting to also know some of the stories and the history behind that. So maybe within and the viewers get a bit of an understanding as to why this is significant.
Part of
I know.
That is my favorite. I mean, I do enjoy the cavalcades. I really enjoy watching that, the precision, and just knowing, you know, that our forces are up to speed. I enjoy that part. So don't you?
And he's not far. He's not far, so he knows how excited we are to have him in studio when that part comes on, because it's one of those that just also gives you hope as a South African, and you feel proudly South African as we're looking at this. You know, not only do you see, as some would say, beautiful visuals for television, but you see the discipline, you see what goes into all the work, and the selection of, you know, those who are part of the parade. Who are they? How are they selected? Just all of that going into, you know, into fruition. So a lot of the conversations around that for me are quite interesting, Sakina, particularly when you think about the 21 gun salute. A lot of people say, why do you still need it in this day? So I think when Brigadier comes, it will be such an interesting way to then also learn about that very aspect, because it's not only about the outfits.
Yeah. Totally.
It's not only about the outfits, but the feathers and everything.
But let's not talk that down, because, you know, there is something about people in uniform, you know, be it men or women. You know, when you see people in uniform, for me at least, it is something that
I'm talking about the outfits on the red carpet, not the other outfits.
I mean, they were not as ostentatious as
I
we've
feel
seen
like
it
you should have been on the red carpet. Maybe walked it a little bit. just me. But you know, Sakina, talking about something very serious as well, and I think tonight a number of South Africans are grappling with this one, and they want to know what becomes of the social, you know, the SDR grant. Because a lot of people have been talking about access, the qualifying criteria again becoming either too tedious for them, difficult now, and a number of people still being left behind. So I wonder then, what are they looking to the president to say tonight about that?
Indeed, that is a big one. And I was hoping that we would have time with Minister Lindiwe Zulu, because when I spoke to her here last year, before the State of the Nation address, she had said to me that at this point, a basic income grant is practically a fait accompli. What they are working on are the modalities. So I would love to catch up with her just to find out, so how far have we moved, because it's a year later. But of course there are proponents against the introduction of a basic income grant. There are proponents for it, and a lot of the opposition to it stems from whether we can afford this as a nation. We already have more than 18 million South Africans receiving grants in this country, which is an extraordinarily high number. It is unsustainable in the long run. So what are we going to do about that? It's one thing to say, yes, we get it, we understand that people need to have some form of sustenance from somewhere, and if government has to be the one to provide it, so be it. But for how long? And that number keeps growing. So it's a bit of a catch-22, if you will.
And you listen to those who are for it. The first question they ask you is, can we afford to not do it? This needs to have come on board. It will stimulate the economy and all of that. But where is it going to come from? Where is the money going to come from? Because ultimately, Sakina, you know, one of the things that the president talks about, for example, even last year, is the story of Thando Makubo, who started the business, that Soweto Creamery, I think it's called, with 350 Rand. Fast forward a year later, Thando is not able to continue. He's trying to keep his business alive because load shedding is really not making things easy for him.
Have we gotten to the bottom of how Thando actually started that business?
The president says, Mr. Thando, and I'm going to go back to his words last year. Some people use that money to start businesses. Mr. Thando Makubu from Soweto received the 350 Rand for 7 months last year and saved it to open an ice cream store that now employs 4 people.
Yeah, you know, I had Thando on the radio show that I host on SAFM, and when I got to that particular question, unfortunately the line cut.
Oh no!
Yes,
that very
question, because I wanted to find out from him. I wanted to understand. whether that is indeed true, whether he was able to open that particular business solely dependent on the 350 social relief of distress grant money, or whether there were other financial stimuli that he was able to have access to.
And you think of people like Tando, who then would employ people, but then they now have to let them go, and many other businesses. So if you talk about the basic income grant, as you say, the numbers keep increasing. With the rolling blackouts now coming into play, you can expect that more and more people are being laid off. So this simply then means, are you then going to add on to this number of 18 million and be able to afford? Because others are calling for 1,500 rand, I think, with the basic income grant. So can you afford it for 18 million people?
But again, going back to your question, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because can you afford not to do it, especially given the high levels of unemployment? The youth unemployment rate in this country is a ticking time bomb. You cannot sit by the expanded definition with 75% of your youth unemployed. That is asking for trouble. And unfortunately, the reality is you can drive through any township in South Africa at any time, and you will see these young people, just loitering around. And you know what they say about young people who have nothing to do, and idle mind being the devil's workshop, which brings me to another thing that I hope the president will address tonight, the scourge of drugs in our communities, because this has now reached crisis proportions.
And you look at what the Premier of Gauteng, Panyaza Lesufi, has also tackled as one of his priority areas, because a number of parents approaching him saying that this is not being looked at as a pandemic, but it actually is in our townships. Are young people finding themselves smoking whatever they can, lay their hands on. And I don't know if you remember, Sakina, there was a certain point where we started seeing what they would call Bluetooth, where some of them would draw the blood and share with another, addict, and that alone,
so that they could get high.
Yeah, and it posed a lot of health risks. It posed a lot of risks, and this is what the Gauteng Premier is now tackling, through some of these particular programs, saying that for him this is priority, and he wants to make sure that a lot of these young people are not only now clean, but they also need to get access to some kind of work, some kind of training.
Where? And it brings, we're going to watch our armed forces, representatives paraded here in a short while, but I've been wondering about, some form of conscription for young people. If we cannot absorb them into meaningful employment or education, what do we do with them? Are we thinking long and hard enough about what to do with our young people?
And Sakina, one thinks about even some of what the president said last year, that government does not create jobs, and that of course came with its own backlash. But you think about how government should also be creating an enabling environment for businesses to then be able to thrive and be able to absorb more of these young people. But at the same time, more of these young people need access to ministries like small business development, so they are able to then be able to start their own businesses, be able to start employing others, because you get a sense that there's a lot of lamenting of the numbers. The number of young people who are unemployed is just, we're lamenting over it all the time. But is enough being done to make sure that when we now get the new stats, it doesn't become another big nightmare again, where we see the numbers increasing, or will we see the numbers going down? You think about the EPWP programs, for example, those have become contentious in the townships, because even the handing of those opportunities to some has become a political hot potato. And of course, as you can see there, the premiers making their way into the City Hall. Of course, it's been declared a parliamentary precinct, so the premiers are now making their way in. And Sakina, talking about making their way in, it's interesting that Samgela was asking this morning, are we going to see Deputy President David Mabuza
Well, we'll see soon enough.
Making his way in.
We'll know soon enough.
That's been the one question Samgele's been asking everyone. And I wonder then if he comes.
Yeah, we'll know in a short while. But looking at the premiers going in, so we saw on the red carpet two conversations that I caught. The one with Premier Alan Winde of the Western Cape, and they were talking about the devolution of power. And it seems as though, the Western Cape would like to have more autonomy in dealing with more of its own issues, like energy, like crime, those sort of things. And Premier Winde was saying that he was having conversations with the Gauteng Premier, Banyaza Lesufi, about the crime situation and how to tackle that. So it's interesting. Bushi Mape, the Premier of the Northwest Province, he was also speaking to some.
He says there are no potholes on some roads.
On some roads, yeah, but others are still bad.
And you think about the Northwest Province, Sakina, and I was listening to his comment about Dijobotla, and he says that's yesterday's news. And one wonders if really Dijobotla is yesterday's news for the politicians and not necessarily for the people who are looking to see if in fact they will get their desired service delivery. So as you can see, they're the members of the the judiciary
yes,
making their way in there, and you can see the Chief Justice, and you can see the Deputy Chief Justice Mandi Samaya making their way in there. So definitely it does look like we'll probably be starting at some point soon, but one wonders then inside, Sakina, with the threats by the EFF, if of course there'll be more delays to the president taking the podium.
Absolutely, that is to be expected, but of course we also saw the South African Police Service members out in full force, and they seem to be ready for whatever eventuality may actually evolve from that. But I just wonder, must we always be subjected to this? And when I say this, I mean all of it, because it's become so predictable now, not just what we are watching now, but also just everything, the proceedings, the speeches have become predictable.
And I was in conversation with Sinao Tambo in the past few days from the EFF to say, isn't this going to be more of the same? And you'll find yourselves outside and watching the State of the Nation address, probably from your phones, on your app, and all of that. We know probably how it goes. And he said, no, watch the strategy we'll put in place this time. Let's see if in fact things are different. So it's interesting to see if things will be different or not. And our favorite part seems to be starting there.
Indeed, perhaps we can invite the Brigadier to come and join us. And as we do that, because now this is where we need education as well, talking us through the